So join me, please, in welcoming Scott Rae and Rae and Langer to the IACE podium.
Well, thank you, David. Good evening, folks. It's great to be with you all. It's good to come back to my roots here in Texas. I grew up in Houston, spent a lot of years in the Dallas-Fort Worth area before emigrating to Southern California. I married a native and recognized my folks' worst nightmare came true. Well, thankfully they love her, but marrying a native Californian, they knew once that happened, I was going to stay. So it's a delight to be with you all. Rick and I are thrilled to have our book, David, as the first volume in the IACE imprinted series. Thank you for the honor of that. And we are delighted to be with you all tonight. I want to start with a case scenario. You've got it in front of you. We're going to give you an opportunity to talk about this, and then we will circle back to it toward the end. But you are on the board of trustees of a Christian university in your community. You and your spouse both attended the school, as have some of your children, all of whom had a wonderful experience during their years there. You wanted your kids to have the same experience you did as you left, more grounded in your faith and more committed to Jesus than when you entered. When you were asked to join the board of trustees, you said yes enthusiastically. You've been on the board for several years and are beginning to notice some trends at your school that have you a bit troubled. For example, a recent advertising campaign for the school has recently gotten your attention, mentioning the school's Christian heritage and shying away from stronger Christian language about growing in one's faith and integrating faith into all aspects of life and study. At the same time, you've noticed the way that the provost and deans talk about faith integration has changed a bit. They now refer to teaching their classes from a Christian perspective as opposed to what you consider more robust and costly training and modeling of integration. At the most recent board meeting, the board was asked to consider two changes that reflect the difficult financial times that the school and many other schools like yourselves find themselves in. First, given the demographic cliff that they are facing in their state, the board is considering admitting non-Christian students for the first time in order to increase this declining enrollment. The requirement of a statement of faith is particularly challenging for the recruitment of athletes, especially given that your school is now competing in a higher division than for most of the school's history. You've also heard some talk about chapel and Bible requirements being reduced, since that's not the reason that you anticipate a increasing number of students will be coming to your school. You have heard others suggest that accepting non-Christian students would be mission consistent with an evangelistic goal of reaching the next generation of non-Christian students. The second change the board is asked to consider goes a step further, hiring non-Christian faculty to teach in some of the non-Bible theological disciplines, such as math, statistics, and engineering, since there is no such thing as a, quote, Christian math or a, quote, Christian engineering. You already do not require theological alignment for some staff, such as maintenance, food service staff, those that do not have substantive contact with students. You are finding that you are having difficulty competing financially with secular universities and or industry for these potential faculty members, and you wonder if this change might be necessary to have qualified faculty in these areas. You are also hearing the vetting of adjunct faculty being less rigorous than the full-time faculty, which concerns you because of the number of adjuncts the school hires annually for financial reasons. Okay, now turn it over. And this is what I want you to think about. We're going to give you about probably 2 or 3 minutes with the person next to you to talk about this. So what's your reaction to what you are hearing and observing? Do you find any of these changes and perspective changes troubling? If so, which ones and why? This is just an exercise to get us warmed up a little bit on the subject. Like our worship leaders, we also had a very big Mexican dinner. And so before all the blood that should be in your brain goes to your stomach, let's talk about this. We'll come back in about 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll have some more input for you.
Good job. You made it in the time allotted. I didn't hit the stop on time, was it? Yeah. I think you pitched it just right. Because you were definitely moving. But the point is, they have a written copy of the speech. that knee of yours?
Yeah, it's giving me a little trouble here, man.
I feel for you on that count, man. That kind of stuff wears you down. So, yeah,
Yeah, it's actually not. It's not for walking. It's standing in one place.
yeah. And getting up and down is that?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
when it locks.
I remember that with my back. It's whatever position you find yourself in is, you manage it, and then you have to move, and it's like terrible. All right, let me call your attention back up to the front. I trust you're having a good conversation since you're like completely ignoring me about We'll pick up on a couple of these kinds of things as we go on through the talk, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end of this time that will allow for some more interaction. These kinds of questions are really important. Scott and I were talking about this before about there's a lot of things that we teach, both of us teach, that you can almost not teach without case studies. To teach them in the abstract is not to teach them at all. And so this is one of the things you want to do is get yourselves thinking about your own institutions. Hopefully you found some things that you might resonate with this, and we want to think a little bit about how do we navigate these kinds of waters in the course event. So that will be coming on down the pipe. I want to take a few minutes. Scott and I will kind of do two different things here. I'm going to talk a little bit about things related to the mission of the Christian University and the integration of faith and learning. Scott will talk about a batch of things related to some of the structural things about institutional life. And I think you'll find if you pick up our book that we made a serious effort to say part of making a successful Christian university is have a vision for what does it really mean to be Christian. But part of it is saying that vision has to be sustained by institutional structures. And if you don't do both, you'll end up probably doing neither. That's the rub. These two things belong together. So we will talk about those things and then take some time at the end for the Q&A. So a couple of words on the integration of faith and learning. Let me just begin by saying integration is not one of many tasks of the Christian university, but it is the defining task of the Christian university. It's the way that the university embodies and expresses the most central truth of the Christian faith, and that is that Jesus is Lord of all, that he is preeminent throughout the entire cosmos. It's a crazy claim that we make, but notice we recite things like that in Nicene creeds. These are things that are built into our thinking, but part of what is entailed by the statements we make is that when we see the world in relationship to Jesus Christ. Let me just pick up the words of the Apostle Paul on this regard from Colossians chapter 1, verses 15. Well, I'll look at 15 through 17. You can go on through verse 23 about the preeminence of Jesus. But here's what he says. He, referring to Jesus, is the image of the invisible God. He's the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were made, whether things in heaven or on earth, visible or invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were made through him and for him. And that last phrase is the real punchline of all of this, that there's nothing that exists that doesn't find its telos in Jesus. Any artifact you find is defined by the reason it was made, and this passage is telling us everything and anything we ever see was made for Jesus. Now that is a huge claim. And let me just make a quick observation. So that's all of creation. Let me give you my favorite definition of culture. Culture is what creatures do with creation. So all that culture is whatever we creatures, and really the only culture-making creatures are you and me, human beings. But in effect, this passage is saying all of creation, and then all of the things that creatures do with creation, none of that can be properly understood until it's understood in relationship to Jesus Christ. There is nothing in all of creation or culture that is rightly ordered until it is ordered towards Jesus as its telos. The world is not transparently, obviously that way. We live in a fallen world. We live in a world that denies the reality of Christ, certainly denies the deity of Christ, and absolutely denies his lordship and his preeminence. So we cannot assume the average person, even if they're a believer, will walk into our Christian institutions automatically thinking this way about Jesus Christ and the created order of which he's a part. So part of our mission is to help them think that way. And indeed, I would say our defining mission is to do exactly that, to help them to have an authentically Christocentric vision of the entire cosmos. That's why we exist. And if we don't do that, no one will do that for us. Are you planning on trusting that to NBC? Are you planning on trusting that to whom, if not us? So that is the first thing that I want to say about integration. It is not an add-on. It is the defining task, and it is the thing that makes us exist as Christian universities. Now, having said that, second doctrinal point I'd like to make about the integration of faith and learning is that we are people who read creation as revelation. In other words, the created order is something that gives us a window into the mind of God. Here's an interesting way to think about it. God's kind of funny. He's a little different than you and I are. But when he has something on his mind and he speaks a word, sometimes words come out. And so you get a sermon that is given to a prophet, or Jeremiah's, temple sermons, or whatever those things might be. Sometimes when God wants to reveal his mind, he does it with a word and the word comes out. Sometimes when God wants to make his thoughts known, he speaks a word and crazy things happen. He says, let there be light, and what do you get? Light! You don't get L-I-G-H-T, you just plain get light. And then you get dry land, you get all these things. When he speaks a word, all kinds of things come to being. That word is a revelation. It makes us know things about the mind of God. We were singing about this. I swear I had no coercive power over those who were leading worship, but we sang, "This is our Father's world." And we began to sing about how all of creation is proclaiming the praise of God. Creation is a revelatory act. We followed it up by singing "Great is Thy Faithfulness" and discovered that we're joining with nature's manifold witness to the faithfulness of God. A friend of mine gave a great illustration. We were watching a movie. One of the things I've done with training people to do integration is just look at cultural artifacts and kind of read them theologically. So I do this with faculty groups, and we do things that are indigenous to their discipline. So I had someone from the CMA, the Cinema and Media Arts department with us, and so she had this TV show she wanted us to read, or to watch. So we watch it, and then we're having the discussion, and she starts talking about the guy who was sitting behind the desk. He said, "Did you see the red tie he had, and then the poster on the wall behind him that was red?" And she had this whole thing going on in her mind about what was happening on this TV set with these different colors and all. And I'm like, I think you're getting overly optimistic about what was really going on there, right? Well, maybe he just brought a red tie that day. And she looked at me and said, "Rick, have you ever seen a movie set before they start filming?" And I'm like, is this a trick question? Because the answer is obviously no. And she said, "It looks like a gigantic Costco that is completely empty and painted flat black. There is nothing on that stage until the director decides to put it there." And I thought, oh my gosh, what a perfect illustration of creation ex nihilo. The world was without form and void. And if something got stuck into the world, it's because the director wanted it to be there. And I would point out that if the director put it there on reason, if you want to know what was in the director's mind when he made that film, you should pay attention not just to the script, to the words, but also to the world and the images that he's putting before you, because he's making both, right? The script and the things that you see. Welcome to planet Earth. Welcome to a Christian perspective on the cosmos that we live in. And again, I would say that is not typical of the world in which we live. Scientists do not read the created order revelatorily, usually. They don't read it as an act of revelation. They don't see intentionality in it. The same way I was failing to see intentionality in things that once my colleague pointed it out, I realized she's really right. I bet there is a reason that it was that way. I just never had an imagination for there being a reason. So part of what we do with the integration of faith and learning is helping people read the world better, to understand there's things that are revealed about the mind of God that will not be seen and understood if you don't look at the created order that you're a part of as if it is actually an act of revelation. So those are two huge things that once those pennies drop, I think it becomes really clear that we're not really doing our job of helping our Christian students become well-formed Christian disciples if we're allowing them to come and go from our institutions blind to the revelatory work of Christ and also his preeminence throughout all of the cosmos. So, having said that, I'm a huge fan of doing integration of faith and learning and doing it seriously like it really mattered. Having said that, let me then say it isn't always so easy to be able to train and equip people to do that. That isn't the way they come to you. We hire people from all over the world, actually, in terms of where they get their degrees from. But I'm just guessing that if someone went and studied something at Cornell and got their PhD, they didn't get a lot of training in seeing the world in the way I've just described it, right? They probably got none. So how do we equip people to do that? Now, well, hey, shameless plug for book, right? There are things that we put in the book. I'm not going to make any pretense to doing that, but I want to take a couple minutes and just share before I turn things over to Scott a couple of things that I have done over the course of 20 years on working on training faculty in this that I think are valuable and worth just pointing out. There's a whole bunch of other things that could be said, but let me just pick up on these few things. First and foremost, I would encourage you to view training faculty, training those who are doing integration and faith and learning as much more analogous to growing a tree than building a building. Building a building, you get the blocks, you stick them on there, it's a bit formulaic. Growing a tree is very different than that. Growing a tree, let me just pause here. The reason I thought of this illustration, because of an experience I had with our board at Biola, I was talking about a thing we were doing for training our faculty for doing integration. We called it the Coalition of the Willing. And it was a year-long small group experience where people came together, we did some reading together, we would talk about stuff, we would do this over meals, and then the last half of the time, we would go out, we'd watch a movie, we went to the Disney Concert Hall, we went to an art museum, we did all kinds of things, reading the theology behind cultural artifacts. People had a great time, it was wonderful. We were doing this, we'd done this probably 3 or 4 groups, and the board was like, oh, this is a great thing to do. How can we make it required, and how much faster could you do this if we gave you more money? I was like, okay, let me repeat the name of the group. It was called the Coalition of the Willing, so that's a bit of a problem. The other thing is, when you say, if we threw more money at it, what would we get? And I would say that's like throwing more fertilizer on your tree and hoping it will grow faster. And I said, what we're trying to do is grow a culture of integration, not create learning outcomes of integration. We want this to be in our lifeblood. We do not want it to be a check mark that everyone has to do to get, tenure or whatever else they might have to have. That might be included in the package, but that's not the heartbeat. So I did a lot of things that were intended to build a Christian learning community. I did very few activities. Well, let me put it this way. I did a lot of activities without a lectern. I did very few activities without a meal. So we were constantly having lunch or having dinners or doing things and having the long talk instead of the short lecture or even the long lecture. Because I wanted people to be articulating their thinking about this, not just hearing others do that. So huge task of that kind of culture building, and I found that to be a huge way to draw people because people actually enjoy that. I can't count the number of faculty that said, this is what I came to a Christian university for. This kind of interdisciplinary, collegial Christian conversation. We often don't create a context where that could happen. So I was meal heavy. The cool thing about underpaying your faculty, if you offer them a free lunch, they suddenly become part of the Coalition of the Willing. I mean, it's stunning how that works. Okay, second thing, making sure that integration of faith and learning is indigenous to the discipline. So academic disciplines, they have their own way of talking about things, their own field of study, and we have a knack for throwing in Jesus in ways where he seems kind of like he doesn't belong there. It's what I call presencing Jesus like a parent at a junior high dance. I have been a parent at a junior high dance. And you have this weird phenomenon that you're standing in the back of the gym while the junior hires are like doing whatever it is that they call dancing. And they're looking at you and going, what is that guy going to leave and what is he doing here to begin with? And I'm looking at them and asking myself the question, when am I going to leave? And what am I doing here to begin with? I feel like I just don't belong. And sometimes we presence Jesus in ways that just make him not fit with the discipline. We throw in a Bible verse that's kind of like, oh, okay. My favorite example of this is Tim Tebow doing a post-football game interview where he talks about, I want to thank my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And then he goes on to talk about the zone blitz package that he was facing. And it's hard not to feel like the two don't mesh. Now, good news, Tim Tebow wasn't trying to do integration of faith and learning. He was trying to do evangelism. So kudos to Tim. But I would like to point out that any student sitting in the class, if you were doing that with business or literature or things like that, if you threw in Jesus that way, what you're tacitly saying, Jesus doesn't really belong here, but we want to stick him in. And let me strongly encourage you to always be thinking of ways in which you presence Jesus if he belongs there. Why? Because he does. That's what we were just looking at. Every single thing was not only made by him, but for him. So it's incumbent upon us as Christian faculty and trainers to say, how does Jesus actually fit? How does he belong in these disciplines? Now that's a topic that's as diverse as the disciplines, and I won't even try to dive into those details here, but I want to plant the seed of the importance of making integration indigenous. And then finally, to think about integration theologically, that you're thinking about it not just with hanging a Bible verse on something to make it appear Christian, but you're thinking about the theology of it. To take an example, I've heard people say the rebuttal to Marxism is, the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not steal, because Marxism denies private property, and so you're stealing. And so it's like you shoot a Bible BB at the tank of Marxism. And I'd like to suggest you probably won't stop the tank with that. And it's partly because Marxism is not making a single narrow claim about private property, but it's making a massive narrative about all of human history, driven by historical materialism, making claims about what human beings are and how human beings are transformed by the way they relate to the means of production. There's a whole vast pile of things that are woven into Marxism. And so its proper Christian conversation partner is not a single Bible verse, but a theology of the kingdom, perhaps. And that's what you'd want to have the interaction with, not just these isolated passages. So I would use again and again with the faculty the phrase of developing a theological imagination for your discipline, to understand what is really going on in your discipline theologically, and then allow those seeds to kind of grow and sprout and fertilize in the context of what you're teaching. That way it becomes both indigenous, but you're far more likely to be coordinating things that actually belong and fit together. So those are a few things that I want to say, and just before I turn it over to Scott, let me just read a quick quote from a colleague of mine. We were going through prioritization and a bunch of things that I've just talked about the importance of integration, the centrality of Christ, how do we communicate that. These were things that we were very concerned about, but we also realized we had problems with finances and other stuff like that, so we went through a process called prioritization. And there were questions about if we were prioritizing well, and my friend put this very well, and here's what he wrote. He said, the first question we should ask concerning prioritization is not, what should we cut in order to be financially viable? Our first question should be, what must we keep at all costs in order to be faithful to what God has called us to do and be? The mission question for us must be first, not merely one criterion among many. And I think he distilled into that an enormous amount of wisdom of just saying, what are the first things? The first thing for a Christian institution is to be a Christian institution. And we must do that at all costs, and then ask, in light of that, what do we keep and how do we prioritize? So those are a few thoughts. Let me turn things over to Scott for some more things institutionally.
Thank you. Thank you, Rick. You should see him when he really gets wound up. Amen?
Amen.
Well, I appreciate the segue, too, because I want to talk about a few institutional things that have to do with protecting the university's mission. And both, the stuff on integration that Rick mentioned and stuff that I'll talk about here in the next couple of minutes all comes out of our experience. So this is sort of what we've learned from being really close to this. I mean, Rick's given 20 plus years of his life to the integration of faith and learning. I've given the last 8 years in my role as advisor to the president for university mission. And I recognize that the advisor to the president and the president are not the same thing. And every day I thank the Lord that that's not true, or that is true. So I've been really close to a lot of decisions that the president has made to help keep the train on the tracks. But it's been his responsibility to actually make sure that these things happen, and I've been advising behind the scenes. So I think there are a couple of assumptions that I think we have to make just at the beginning to make sure we're on the same page. And the first one of these is that mission fidelity is everybody's business in the university. In recent years, we've started saying that enrollment management is everybody's business, and that's true. But the mission of the university is everybody's concern. It's not just the cabinet, it's not just the top leadership, it's not just the faculty, it is everybody's concern. And it's not just the realm of the Bible and theology folks. Okay? I beware of the place that's where the department, say in the sciences or in the humanities, says, we'll assess the candidate's professional qualifications. You all on the Bible side, you handle the theological stuff. You handle the mission stuff. Okay? That's a division that I think is a dangerous one. And our deans in all of our disciplines, our department chairs in all of our disciplines need to recognize that mission fidelity is their business too, as well as those of us that work on the theological side of the house. The second assumption, I think we've learned this too, is that mission fidelity requires constant vigilance. It cannot be put on automatic pilot and left to go on its own. Little departures are almost always where mission drift begins. And sometimes they look negligible, but those invariably open the door to changes that come down in the future. And I would encourage all of you, if you're not already, to be a student of the founders of your institution. Because in our view, your founders, not the board, not the cabinet, not the faculty, your founders hold the mission of the school. And ultimately, it's to your founders that you are accountable. Now, we recognize that our founders were not infallible. They were not perfect human beings. But they were onto a lot of really important things when they founded your school. And the legacy that they set when they founded it is worth preserving. And as I say, be very careful of the person who comes to your institution thinking that somehow the legacy the founders left is something that we're not fully proud of, or considering the founders as sort of the first step in a reclamation project that they and others are attempting to undergo in your school. Now, what would be some of the signs that a school might be drifting from its mission? Okay, now, unfortunately, I think the clearest view of this, the 2020 view of this, is clearly in the rearview mirror. After schools have already drifted, and we do sort of a post-mortem, because what we discovered over, probably 3 or 4 centuries of schools drifting from their original mission, is that once the drift happens, it is a Herculean task to reverse that. It's almost like doing a 180-degree turn of a giant cruise ship. I mean, if it happens, it takes a lot of time and a whole lot of effort. The closest group I've seen, Baylor, I think, has tried that. They tried that Herculean step about a decade ago, and I think they came, I think, part of the way back. I'm not persuaded that they came all the way back, but I think they would tell you that it was a major effort to try and get that done. So I would suggest viewing this along a continuum of things that are definitely not mission drift on one end, and things that are definitely, clearly mission drift on another, but a lot of stuff in the middle where we would say possibly, maybe probably, or, possible, but probably not, and to weigh them along that continuum like that. So, for example, in the probably not category might be reducing the number of chapel opportunities because of space considerations or staffing considerations. It's not that we think chapel is less important, but logistically, we've just had to make some accommodations. Okay? Or another example of this might be efforts to recruit minority students and faculty to diversify the school. I'd say now we want to be careful of some of the ideas and ideologies that we might be importing with that, but I'd say by itself, that's probably not an instance of mission drift. On the other hand, in the definitely category would be changes to the theological core convictions of the school. Changes to what Rick and I would call in the book your sacred core theologically. And this is not to be confused with openness on non-essential matters, though to be clear, some things that were doctrinal hot buttons a generation ago are not any longer. And what you define as essential and non-essential, I'd watch what some of those changes are, because I think that's one of the ways to drift from your core theological convictions. I'd say loosening of vetting procedures for missional fit, I think is a pretty good indicator that there's something to watch out for. Referring back to our case study a bit, I think hiring of non-Christian faculty, I think would be an evidence of things to really be careful about. I'd say that likely constitutes a case of mission drift. In the possibly category, admitting non-Christian students, I'd say at the least, I think Rick and I would both agree that I think there can be a justification for that. I think to have an evangelistic mission, I think, is entirely appropriate, even though we require a confession of faith from every incoming student at Biola University. We hear anecdotal reports almost every semester of faculty members leading some of their students to Christ for the first time. And I think some possibly a de-emphasis on the importance of the public worship together of chapel. Other co-curricular elements that impact the spiritual lives of students, I think, could possibly be. Since I think sort of fundamentally, we are in the integration of faith with life and the academic disciplines, but we are also in the business of the spiritual formation of our students. At least if we're not, we need to stop telling parents that we are. Now, what's involved? Let me just suggest a couple things that we've learned about what's involved in creating a culture for mission fidelity. I think one of the most important things that we've learned is the recognition that the co-curricular staff are just as influential, if not more so, than the faculty. And Rick and I say this as 2 and 3 decade-long faculty members, and that's a painful thing to admit, but I'm persuaded that it's true. Because on the co-curricular side, in the residence halls, the resident directors, the RAs, the chapel folks, in the residence halls, that's the place where students more often than not begin to informally deconstruct their faith, often without someone around immediately to help them reconstruct it. Now, what we several years ago, we mandated that all of the co-curricular staff, everybody who has meaningful contact with students, sign on to all the same theological commitments that the faculty do. We also said that this has always been true of our Board of Trustees, but we also made it true of our development officers, because they have contact with donors and with parents of students. And oftentimes, it's the potential donors and parents of students who they'll hear something that happens in a dorm or on a dorm floor, and they'll think, what on earth is going on at that place? I suspect the looks from some of your faces that you've taken some of those calls yourself. And we would suggest the co-curricular staff need to undergo the same sort of rigorous vetting that the faculty do, and need to sign on to all the same theological commitments that our faculty do. Now, I think it's one thing to get faculty and co-curricular staff to sign on to our statements, but this has to be more than just checking boxes and reading a statement and signing on to it. Maybe having an interview with them. But I think what's really important, what we discovered, is how applicants feel about your school's mission. Not just that they adhere to our convictions. We would call that a necessary but not sufficient condition. But how do they feel about the school's founders and their legacy? Do they wish that they were going to a state university but just happened to be Christian and happened to need a job? Hey, we've overheard potential faculty members at other schools come back from academic conferences saying just that very thing. Do they have a passion for teaching within a Christian worldview? Hey, not only do they have the inclination, but do they have some aptitude? Are they teachable in this? Are the things that excite them about being here things that they could not do in a secular university? What are those things? Do they hold dear the same things that we do and that our founders did? I think to take it a little bit further, how will they know? This is a question our former president was really good at asking. How will they know, how will their students know that their faith is important to their research and to their teaching, to how they approach their discipline? How will they build their students' confidence in their faith in their classes? Okay, now, I don't know how you all vet faculty members or potential faculty members. I suspect that you have a fairly rigorous process in place by which you do that. Where we come from, we have an outside reviewer that helps conduct the fit for doctrinal and theological alignment with a school. Is somebody specifically trained theologically? In fact, it's not unusual in a university to defer to people who have specific expertise in certain areas. And so I don't think it's unusual that we would defer some of the theological vetting to people who have specific advanced theological training. Not that we're asking candidates in sociology to be amateur theologians. Okay? We're not doing that. But people who are trained theologically can be very helpful in teasing out some fine points of theology and asking the right questions to help illuminate what a candidate actually holds. It's also, the reviewer comes from outside the department and outside the particular school that the candidate's applying for. They have no skin in the game as professionally as far as the recruitment of the faculty member or potential co-curricular candidate has in place. Now, what we want to be careful about is that the department chair or the dean and the outside reviewer, if you have one, sit on the same side of the table, both literally and figuratively. We had found for some time that the dean and the candidate often sat on the same side of the table and the reviewer was on the other. That sent a very powerful but unintended message. And sometimes what we had to be careful about was that the dean or the department chair wasn't just trying to get somebody through, as opposed to really vetting the person to see actually what they believed and felt about what they believed about our institution. The dean and the department chair are just as responsible for mission fit, not just professional fit. But they have to share that burden. The dean of our business school is here in our audience. And I know he shares that same passion for ensuring that all the business faculty that he hires share the same theological fit. And I know when they interview candidates, he sits on the same side as the reviewer and the candidates on the other side of the table. And the reviewers have certain schools to which they are assigned. So they get familiarity with the school. And with the faculty and with the dean, and they work together to help vet potential candidates. Now, what we've tried to do is that theological review can be fairly intimidating for somebody who hasn't thought much about theological matters. What we've discovered is that the theological sophistication of our applicants is all over the map. Some are very sophisticated, others not so much, nor do we expect them to be, depending on what their discipline is. But we have a series of questions that we ask to co-curricular staff particularly, and also to our faculty, and they're based on questions that our students have asked us. And, who knows? Who knows when a student is going to ask you some sort of off-the-wall theological question that may be something very deep and profound and meaningful to that student, and they're expecting a well-thought-out answer from you, whether your discipline is in the sciences or in literature or in biblical studies or in theology. I was on the search team for our Vice President for Student Development, which may be, next to the cabinet, may be the most important position in terms of student influence on the entire campus. And so I ran him through a battery of questions, and I said, basically, I don't want the process that you go through. I know you can do that, because sometimes they will say, well, we need to just sit down with a cup of coffee and really get the backstory for why students are asking that question. I'm not interested in that. Okay? I know you can do that. What I want to know is the student who asked you, who's got 60 seconds at the end of class and is running off to something else, how are you going to answer them? And so what we asked for were Twitter or X responses, and limit to be succinct. So here's some of the questions that our students have asked us, and we've collected these into a sort of a manual for deans and department chairs to use not as a checklist but as a menu. So here, I'll just give you a couple. There's a long list of these in the book, but this will just highlight sort of what they are. Say a student says, why should I believe the Bible is a reliable account of the life of Jesus? What would you tell him in a Twitter response? How would you describe the big story of the whole Bible? Suppose a student asks you, why do you believe that the resurrection of Jesus is true? Or a student says, I think Jesus was a great moral teacher, but I'm not sure about him being God. By the way, these are all questions that our students who signed a profession of faith to come to Biola have asked us. Student says, I don't understand how you can reconcile God's love and grace with his wrath and judgment. How can you believe faith in Christ Jesus is the only way to God and to heaven? What's the definition of the gospel? In fact, what we regularly ask faculty candidates, I want to know God personally. How would you lead me to Christ? Right there on the spot. Okay. What would you say to a student who says, I can have a vibrant spiritual life, but I don't need the church? What would you say to a student who was struggling with same-sex attraction? Or a student who came to your office and said they feel like that they are a man trapped in a woman's body? Okay, you get the idea. And I think there are a handful of these, some that have to do with marriage. And why can't marriage simply be any committed couple who loves each other, is committed to God, and wants to contribute to their community? Okay? In fact, when we were going through this with one of our candidates for VP of Student Development, so one person on the search team, they said, I wonder what some of our faculty would say to some of these questions. And I thought, well, you might be onto something. Let me close with this, and I'll turn it back over to Rick. I think there are also some questions you can take back with you to ask your wider leadership group in your institution, or whatever your particular sphere of influence is. And so let me just suggest some of these. If your founders were to found your school today, what issues would they find important? In fact, would they found your school at all today if they were around? And then here's maybe the most important of these. Are you still doing what they founded the school to do originally? Second, how are you assuring mission fidelity in your particular institution? Because as is a phrase I got from Rick, very insightful, you get what you inspect, not what you expect. Third, what are you doing to equip your faculty to think Christianly and theologically? How much money have you invested in this because you get what you pay for in this area? Fourth, what questions are you asking new faculty and new hires to ensure that they fit with you missionally and theologically? And then I think a reminder for what Rick had suggested, when you cut budgets, how do you frame it? Not, what can we cut in order to stay solvent, but what must we keep in order to stay missionally faithful? Okay?
All right. Thank you, Scott. And I would say those questions that Scott went through, if there's one thing that I would really underscore the value of is having those kinds of somewhat open-ended, maybe, I'm not so sure I want to get it down to Twitter because you can hardly say anything, but, you know, the short...
They don't obey that rule.
Yeah, what I was going to say, I say land your plane. Don't tell me there's multiple options. Believe it or not, I already know that. Land your plane. What is your option? What would you say? And it's incredible to see what is manifest with that. And you may be thinking, that'll take a long time, and I'll say, you bet. Scott and I got into this at a dean's retreat, and one of the deans, the dean for our psychology school, Rosemead School of Psychology, they spend a day and a half interviewing prospective candidates because of their concern for who they hire, especially in a field like psychology is a real challenge. And it is one of those areas where, you know, if you hire in a hurry, you'll have a long time to repent. And better to take a long time to hire and have no need to repent. That would be, yeah, free recommendation. Okay, we have shared enough. Let's take a few moments for Q&A from you guys. If there's things that you would like to ask. I think there's mics there, and then Scott and I will go back and forth depending upon who might need to answer. No questions.
That means we were clear as mud.
Yeah. Well, I don't want, yeah, go ahead.
How is your process for interviewing screening faculty different for adjunct faculty, if at all? Maybe it's not.
Okay, yeah, good question.
Yeah, I can speak to that. We don't do quite the same thing for adjuncts, mainly for logistics' sake. And we're also not committed to adjuncts beyond one semester either. So we're not irrevocably committed. Well, we do require that they fill out the same application as a full-time faculty applicant with the full doctrinal statement. Our doctrinal statement is we warn them in advance. It's pretty long, and you've got to interact with it pretty substantively. And they have a reviewer that reviews their doctrinal section, and then may have further questions or clarifications that usually they do to come back with. And so it's not until the reviewer is satisfied that they're eligible for hire. With a full-time person, we have a full interview, both by the dean and the reviewer. But we just, for logistic reasons, that's the best we can do. Because we probably, Biola, how many adjuncts do you think we hire a semester? Probably
Gobs.
over 100.
Yeah, so the qualification you just gave is the number one thing I look for. I kind of assume I have a lot of people who are coming in who don't know anything about it. And if they're excited and motivated to learn, I'm all in. One of the best experiences I had with a guy who literally came to me because when talking to the president, they asked him about integration faith learning, he said, I have no idea. He was doing some photojournalism kind of things, and they said, well, then you need to go talk to Rick. Well, I had this conversation with him. I could not have had a more open and willing person. And we ended up doing this thing, looking at pictures, having an image reading experience that ended up being reproduced. And we've done this for training for faculty for 7 or 8 years now. It came from a guy who felt like he knew nothing. He kind of did. He was being very forthcoming in that regard. It was true, but he was so willing to learn. It's really, I think it moves just about at the speed of a person's willingness, interest, and desire. So it's very variable. But yeah, I would say the number one thing you want is that kind of openness and willingness. Yeah.
I just wanted to clarify, you had mentioned at one point you don't want to leave the checking on theological alignment with your Bible and theology department, but then you mentioned also bringing in an outside reviewer to check those things. At what point during the process do you kind of have the hiring department do the initial check and then the outside reviewer is at a later stage in the process?
Yeah.
Yeah, at what stage does the reviewer sort of get involved as opposed to the dean of the department chair with the theological review? The dean actually makes the first assessment of that. And depending, I mean, again, I think our deans are pretty theologically sophisticated, but they don't catch everything. And the department, we have encouraged the department chairs before somebody even applies to look at our doctrinal commitments, look at those, and if there are places where you might have pause, the department chair or the head of the search team needs to scope those out first. And if it's pretty rare that we get an applicant who for whom it's obvious that they haven't looked at our doctrinal commitments. So I think that our chairs, are doing a pretty good job initially of screening out folks who are obvious non-fits. So it's just, at each stage, I think the doctrinal review, it gets a little bit more rigorous as we go down the line.
Yeah.
Sorry, yes. So you talked a lot about hiring of new faculty, but what would you do if you inherit a faculty? How do you encourage the promulgation of that among faculty? Do you try to hope for new faculty coming in to spread the excitement and hope for that? Or what is it built into promotion? What kinds of things are you doing to help encourage that if you inherit a faculty?
Are you imagining that would be like an actual problem?
Not at my school.
So I mentioned just incidentally that phrase, the coalition of the willing. That was exactly born of that phenomenon. When I got to Biola, we had what I affectionately call the Book of Judges model of integration, which is everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Now, the good news is they didn't do some of the things that happened in the Book of Judges, so it's all right, that didn't happen. But I realized there is no way I can change a faculty person from the top down. So what I'm gonna do is go from the bottom up, and I'm gonna work with the willing. And I invited people to say, if you're interested in integration, faith, and learning, I'd like you to join a group we'll do work on the same readings, same models of integration, same ways of implementing. We'll just talk about that sort of thing. So we began to do that with a group of 7 or 8 people, year-long small group experience. And we just kept turning that crank. And by now we have gone through probably almost 150 faculty. And we only have 250 faculty or thereabouts at Biola. So you begin shaping the ethos that way. And I am just, now particularly, I never had any kind of administrative authority to remove any faculty anyhow. So I just thought, I'm just going to fertilize the grass and not worry about killing the weeds, so to speak. And that was, in answer to the question, that's what I did.
Yeah, I would say I've seen that at our school as well.
It's worked fairly well. If I were to go back and do it again, I would do it the same way. That's different than saying it solved all problems. Yeah.
I do have some authority to kill the weeds. But yeah, one of the things that we've done in my advice to the president is whenever he talks about our theological commitments, to make sure that he emphasizes to faculty, to applicants, that these are our sacred boundaries. And these define who we are, but it also sets boundaries around who we are not. And I think he's had the wisdom, I think, to recognize that, it may be over time some people's theological convictions have changed, which I think does happen from time to time. And instead of, I think we've encouraged what we would call a self-selection of people who recognize that they no longer fit. For us, that's worked pretty nicely. But that involves the upper levels of leadership being clear and consistent about what those boundaries are, and that we take them really seriously. And if you don't fit in those boundaries, we will be happy to find another place for you to serve.
Do you find
And
that
sometimes,
folks,
yeah, not necessarily institutionally.
do you find that folks come back, they ask you for repeat participation in your Coalition for the Willing, just because it's not a one-time, it's a growth process, and so they may find themselves understanding their discipline deeper and wanting to know more about how they can integrate faith in their disciplines?
Yes, we do have people come in. The other thing is, if you were to look in the book, you'll find, I think, probably a dozen different activities that we do. So continuing education is absolutely the order of the day. This just happened to be one thing that came up in that regard, but it has been a very, very significant thing for shaping culture. I think I see
Thank you.
David, either he got up because his back was sore or he wants us to get off the stage and give him the mic. So I think it's the latter.
Thank you, folks.
Under the wire.
Bonus time. What role does one's choice of their local church of attendance and the doctrinal beliefs of that church play into an employee's position? And to your point about convictions changing and things like that, if you have an employee that decides to change church attendance or what their church is and that belief and that whole process?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I wouldn't say it's a deal breaker, but I think in most cases that would elicit a conversation, especially if the denomination or the church that they're joining, has doctrinal convictions that are different than ours. Now, I think it's entirely possible for somebody to change churches and be in a denomination where you don't necessarily agree with everything they do, but you like most of it.